Today at the National Press Club, Greens leader Adam Bandt. With their largest ever presence in the federal parliament, the Greens are exercising their new influence. But holding the balance of power in the Senate means juggling ambition and pragmatism. Adam Bandt with today's Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra for today's Westpac address. My name is Anna Henderson and I'm the Chief Political Correspondent for SBS World News, also representing National Indigenous Television. I'm also a board member here at the club. Our guest today is Adam Bandt, the federal member for Melbourne and leader of the Australian Greens, with his address to the National Press Club of Australia entitled Greens in the Balance of Power, if we weren't already aware of that. Now, following the Liberals' election loss, the Greens' parliamentary footprint has been bolstered. The party contends that Australians have watched as the new government hasn't grasped the scale of the housing and climate crisis and claims that continues the denial that characterised the Liberals' decade in power. Of course, others in the building would disagree. But ahead of the May budget, Greens leader Adam Bandt reflects on his power to try and shape policy and legislation, with a look back at the safeguard negotiations and a cast forward to the upcoming debate over support for renters. Adam Bandt is positioning the Greens as Australia's social democratic alternative. He has also faced criticism from those outside his party who say his policies and the billions sometimes associated with them go too far, and from some within his party who maintained he hasn't bargained hard enough to get the climate ambition he promised. Now let's hear from the leader of the Greens, Adam Bandt. So sorry, Adam. I should just also remind everyone, you can follow the conversation on Twitter at PressClubAust or #NPC. Please do, and we welcome Adam Bandt.
Look, thanks very much. And I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri. Respect to the elders here and all over this land, and power to all of those fighting for justice, for treaty, for truth, and for a voice to Parliament. First Nations people have faced so much injustice which must be remedied. I'd like to thank those fighting for treaty, truth and voice for your invitation to be part of something greater than ourselves. All of our children should grow up in a country that has come to terms with who we are, how we got here, and how we intend to move forward. The Greens will campaign for a successful yes vote in the referendum. A successful referendum will be a big step towards treaty and truth-telling. The Liberals, however, are stuck in the past and aren't fit for this century. On The Voice, they're determined to reheat the culture wars and use racist dog whistles reminiscent of John Howard. We're in a climate emergency, but many Liberals still dispute the science. They lack integrity and they pushed a failed economic agenda, leading to record cost of living, record inequality, millions living in poverty, and a housing and rental crisis. And that's why people kicked them out with the Greens' help. Last time I was here, I said that as the Liberals become a far-right irrelevance, Labor is shifting to become the country's centre-right party, with the Greens now the only social democratic alternative. Everything is bearing this out, from Labor lovingly embracing nuclear submarines to saying that job seekers have to remain in poverty to help fund a $9,000 a year tax cut for politicians and billionaires. Labor should be lifting all income support above the poverty line in this budget. But instead, Labor is moving to occupy the political space vacated by the Liberals. Now, Labor holds government in every state and territory on the mainland, together with the Greens here in the ACT. Federally, the Greens hold the balance of power in the Senate. With that power, the federal government has an opportunity to make real, substantive, long-lasting changes, to make a real positive difference in people's lives, to really confront the crises that we're facing as a country. But at the federal level, since their election, instead of seizing the opportunity to make major progress, Labor is largely behaving like a centre-right party, not a progressive party. And the fear I hold is that Labor is more concerned with governing from the centre-right than really tackling the cost of living or climate crises. Labor's climate policy is a case in point. Under the original safeguard put forward by Labor, pollution from entities covered by the safeguard scheme, mainly coal and gas, was set to rise from 140 megatonnes now up to 184 megatonnes. Up to that. Why? Because there was no limit on the 116 new coal and gas projects in the pipeline opening. And coal and gas could increase their pollution as long as they bought enough dodgy offsets. During the negotiations, we bore witness to Labor's determination to keep backing more coal and gas. In a week when the UN Secretary-General and the world scientists pleaded with countries like Australia to stop opening new coal and gas mines, the Labor Party kept saying they wanted to open more coal and gas mines. Negotiating with Labor was like negotiating with the coal and gas lobby. But we used our numbers, we hung on, and we secured a huge hit to coal and gas. The changes secured by the Greens mean there's now going to be a hard cap on pollution, on actual pollution. The cap will mean no matter how many offsets the corporations buy, the law will require actual pollution to start coming down. This puts a limit on the expansion of new coal and gas in Australia. We estimate that we've stopped the equivalent of about half of those 116 new coal and gas projects in the pipeline. We also secured a pollution trigger, which for the first time will give the Minister the power to assess the impacts new projects will have on pollution and reject them if it's going to start lifting actual pollution. For the first time, the government can stop new coal and gas projects if they'll lift climate pollution. In addition, we've also put big financial hurdles in the way of a number of other projects like the Beetaloo and Barossa gas fields proceeding. And when gas giant Santos complains that the government is, quote, handing power to the Greens in the final design of the safeguard mechanism and putting new gas projects at risk, and when the gas lobby backs the Greens in saying the new laws will stop new gas projects, and when the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry says that the concessions we secured have, quote, effectively halted new gas exploration and development into the future, we feel that we're on the right track. But it was the Greens who had to drive these changes, to make something meaningful happen. Labor's plan was not to tackle the climate crisis, but to appear to be tackling the crisis, which is becoming a theme of this government. The Greens say better things are possible. We can do more than just acknowledge the existence of problems. If Labor works with us, we can actually tackle them. But Labor, whether it's on climate, income support, wages, rental relief, or mental and dental health into Medicare, is telling people that better things aren't possible right now. Not yet, not now, it's too hard, too expensive, there's too many constraints, it's out of their control. Rather than taking the opportunity of the death spiral of the Liberals to push the country forward, Labor is moving to the centre-right. But political opportunity is not an excuse to leave people behind. We're in a crisis and we need to act like it. The government can, if it wants to, intervene much more to tackle the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis. People aren't just trying to keep their head above water, they're drowning in rising costs. There are more people waiting for food banks, more people struggling to pay the rent, more people working poor, more people living below the poverty line, and more people worried about the future. People know that Labor didn't cause these crises, but people expect government to now intervene much more to fix the crises. And the budget gives us a chance to address the crisis. Labor says that it faces tough choices in the budget. But if Labor chooses to keep their stage 3 tax cuts, negative gearing, capital gains tax concessions and fossil fuel subsidies, Labor's not making tough choices, they're making bad choices. These aren't tough choices. Tough choices are what people in the cost of living crisis have to make every day. Whether they can afford to eat, whether they can fill up the car with petrol, or whether the child can go swimming. They're tough choices. Labor's not making tough choices, they're making everyone else make tough choices. Labor's stage 3 tax cuts for billionaires and the very rich will cost the budget $254 billion over the next 10 years, a jaw-dropping figure that will blow out again in next fortnight's budget. And instead, that money could provide direct cost of living relief to the people who need it. We could put dental into Medicare, build more affordable homes and make childcare free. But instead of intervening to fix the cost of living and housing crises, Labor is spending $254 billion to benefit billionaires like Clive Palmer and Gina Rinehart. Labor will give every politician a $9,000 a year handout while everyday people do it tough. Well, let's make this very clear. If Labor is determined to keep their stage 3 tax cuts for the billionaires and politicians, they can't expect us to wave through everything else they do in this budget. We are not here to facilitate centre-right budget measures. It's the same with the AUKUS agreement and the $368 billion submarines. They are, as Paul Keating has said, a terrible decision. They don't even address the number one threat to our national security, which, according to former Defence Chief Chris Barry, is the climate crisis. The climate crisis risks societal collapse. Yet Monday's Defence Strategic Review only gave a nod to climate, and mainly through the narrow lens of disaster response. The government should release immediately the climate risk assessment conducted by the Office of National Intelligence, which they are sitting on. We understand that Labor wants to pinch national security from the Liberals, but $368 billion is an expensive price to pay for political expediency. One further test will be whether the budget really taxes the big corporations or whether Labor just flogs them with a wet lettuce. The Tax Office has said that the oil and gas corporations are, quote, systemic non-payers of tax, and it's true. According to the Tax Justice Network, in 2020, Qatar collected approximately $26.6 billion in annual royalties from LNG, while Australia, exporting about the same amount of gas, only collected less than $1 billion from the PRRT. The petroleum resource rent tax, the gas tax that is meant to tax the super profits of these big corporations, is an utter failure. We know the Treasurer is looking at this, but Labor needs to have the courage to not just tinker around the edges, to actually tackle the problem, not just appear to tackle the problem, as is becoming the Labor way. Last week, I outlined the Greens' plan to reform the petroleum resources rent tax and introduce royalties for oil and gas projects that would raise $94.5 billion. This is what we would like to see in the budget, and it would pass the Senate before July. This shouldn't be a hard decision for Labor. A hard decision is trying to find a rental property with a degree in nursing or midwifery in one of our capital cities while being saddled with thousands of dollars of debt. More than 3 million Australians currently owe in excess of $74 billion in student debt. In Labor's October budget, there was more money raised from the interest charge on student loans than there was from the gas super profits tax. Just think about that for a second. The interest on loans to students and former students, students who will benefit our society with their education, are paying more to the government under Labor than the gas corporations under the gas tax, corporations which are driving the climate crisis. And as of today, student debts will go up by approximately $5 billion thanks to the CPI increases. And if Labor won't act on this in the budget, we will introduce measures to deal with it once and for all, with legislation to scrap indexation and freeze student debts. Above all, right now, we are in a housing and rental crisis. Rents have skyrocketed. There are not enough affordable homes. Millions are stressed just trying to keep a roof over their heads. More and more people are sleeping in their cars with their kids. Others are lying awake at night, wondering whether there'll be a letter from the real estate agent telling them that the rent has gone up again by hundreds of dollars a week, or worse, that they'll simply have to leave. More and more people are spending hours in line to simply view a rental property. Some people have not been able to get back into a permanent home after years of floods and fires. Right now, there's a shortage of 640,000 public, community and affordable homes, and it's increasing every year. rents are rising 6 times faster than wages. People are being encouraged to bid higher than the advertised rates, forcing rents higher and higher. According to Homelessness Australia, an average student will be left with $13 a day after they pay their rent. Many essential workers, like nurses and aged care workers, would have to spend 2/3 of their income on rent to afford a place in our capital cities. It does not have to be this way. Labor can freeze rent increases and build more public and affordable homes. Prime Minister says bad luck to renters by mocking these suggestions, calling them pixie dust when I asked about it in question time, or according to Labor backbencher Julian Hill, simply impossible. But it is possible. A rent freeze is both legally and politically possible. During the pandemic, National Cabinet decided to collectively act to protect the interests of renters with a moratorium on evictions. The then PM Scott Morrison reportedly put federal government financial assistance on the table, including through taxation arrangements, as part of a package to provide rent relief. If Scott Morrison can act, Anthony Albanese can as well. The Ministerial Council meeting of Housing Ministers is about to meet, and it should be on their agenda. They could seek a submission from the ACT government, where Labor, in government with the Greens, put caps on rental prices. Scotland, again with the Greens in shared government, has just implemented rental controls, and it could be done here too. The Victorian, South Australian, Tasmanian and ACT governments all froze rent increases during the pandemic. Many state governments already limit rent increases to once a year, and if they simply extended that to 2 years, there would be a 2-year rent freeze. It is unacceptable and irresponsible for the Prime Minister to throw up his hands and put the Greens' rent freeze proposal in the too hard basket when Labor holds almost every seat around the National Cabinet table. So the Greens' proposal, which I am announcing today, is to establish a rent freeze housing fund with an annual $1.6 billion of extra funding for states and territories under the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, effectively a doubling of their existing NHHA funding. States and territories could access this fund if they impose a 2-year rent freeze on rent increases and cap rental increases after that. States could put that money to expanding their own stock by building more public housing or by buying up empty homes or NRES properties to deal with the crisis immediately. This is a real and concrete pathway for the federal government to introduce a freeze on rent increases. We have put to the government that we are ready and willing to pass a housing plan that includes a commitment to coordinate a freeze on rent increases. $5 billion a year invested in public and affordable housing owned by the government, which people could rent for 25 to 30% of their income, along with an immediate doubling of rent assistance for the struggling students, single parents, pensioners, people with disabilities, families and those looking for work as a down payment on raising all income support payments above the poverty line. So there's the pathway for the federal government to deal with the rental crisis, Mr Albanese. The government's own National Housing Finance Investment Corporation has said that we need $15 billion a year invested in public and affordable housing for the next 20 years. The Greens, in the spirit of compromise, have suggested that the federal government should contribute 1/3 of that. Is Labor really saying that they are willing to spend over $500 billion on stage 3 tax cuts for the wealthy and on nuclear-powered submarines, but can't find $5 billion a year for public housing and $1.6 billion a year for a rent freeze in the middle of a housing crisis? Any moderately progressive government would scrap the stage 3 tax cuts and submarines. But even if Labor remains resolutely committed to handing over $9,000 a year to Clive Palmer, there's another way to fund the proposed solution to the housing crisis. Right now, Labor is giving billions in handouts to investors and landlords through negative gearing and capital gains tax handouts. This is driving up prices and rents and locking young people out. Labor's biggest budget expenditure on housing is for tax breaks for wealthy property investors. Labor is making the rental crisis worse. Labor should stop giving handouts to property moguls with more than one investment property and instead use that money to fund a rent freeze, double rent assistance, and build even more government-owned public and affordable housing. This isn't about someone who owns one extra house or flat as an investment in addition to their main residence. They're not affected by the Greens' proposal. We're calling for an end to the tax breaks that the government is currently giving to people who own 3, 4, 12 or 25 properties. It's about the 20,000 wealthy moguls who own more than 6 properties each and claim these handouts for the 151,000 houses that they own between them. Half of all the billions in negative gearing tax concessions goes to the top 20% of households. All up, the Greens' proposal would raise $74.1 billion over the decade and cost $69.4 billion. Tackling the rental crisis actually saves the government money. Instead, Labor wants to gamble $10 billion in the Future Fund and, if it makes a profit, build social and affordable homes with no minimum spend and spending capped at $500 million a year. And if the fund makes a loss, like last year, nothing is spent. Imagine if the government spent no money on public schools one year because a stock market gamble backfired. That's what they're proposing for housing. Labor says it will build 30,000 homes in 5 years across the country and then nothing. And at the end, the waiting lists will be longer than they are now. And even if Labor's bill passed tomorrow, by the next election, there won't be a single home built. We don't need billions gambled on a fund for the future. We need direct investment and help right now. $5 billion a year would see 225,000 homes built. The Greens want to see the government do what governments have done in the past: spend public money on public investments. Governments should just build the damn homes itself, not gamble money on the stock market. Labor is currently pressuring the Greens to pass their weak housing bill that sees the housing crisis get worse. But if Labor wants our support on the housing bill, it needs to come to the table on the rental crisis and on building more public and affordable housing. With all his question time contempt about a rent freeze being pixie dust and his reported delight about campaigning at the next election on his housing bill failing in the Senate, the Prime Minister needs to understand that this isn't an inner-city council meeting and a chance to get even with the Greens. This is a full-blown nationwide rental crisis that needs to be confronted. The Prime Minister's scorn shows he hasn't kept up with the sea change in Australia's housing system. There is now a third of the country who rent. As a group, renters have been ignored by the old parties. The Greens campaigned strongly on renters' rights at the federal election and our vote went up. After investing for many years in our grassroots organising model, another key to our success in the last election, the Greens now have the means to communicate directly with these renters, most of whom don't spend their time listening to the Prime Minister's question time threats. We've already been going to the queues at rental properties inspections in Melbourne and handing out our rent freeze materials. Rent freeze now, ask me how. As well as door knocking in Labor electorates around the country about our stance on Labor's housing bill, and we are receiving great support. People know that as things stand, Labor is actively choosing to make the housing and the rental crisis worse. Labor is the party of property moguls. The Greens are fighting for renters and affordable homes for all. If Labor wants our support on the housing bill, they need a package that meets the scale of the crisis. A package like the one I've just outlined can be legislated and in place before July. Labor negotiated on the Safeguard Bill. They recalled Parliament to deal with power bills, and they should show the same urgency on housing and rents so that everyone has an affordable place to live. As the housing crisis illustrates, this country is not the country that it was 20 or 30 years ago. Its people are progressive, socially democratic, and crying out for change, but government hasn't kept up. And today's Labor is not progressive. with its tax cuts for the wealthy while keeping people in poverty. Labor nods towards the crises we're facing, but comes up with plans that see the problem get worse. Basically, they're saying we're on it, but they're not. As the Liberals become irrelevant and Labor shifts to the centre-right, the Greens' aim for the next decade is to grow our power and make real change in this country. People face insecure work and insecure housing. Real wages are going backwards, as is the quality of life. People are worried about the future and they face a cost of living and a climate crisis. People reject racism, transphobia and ableism, and they want real action on the environment. The Greens aim to be the party of renters, whose number continues to grow, and the party of stressed mortgage holders forced to buy at prices inflated by the old party's handouts to property moguls. We will also be the party of choice for a generation of young people who've been left behind by the old parties. For people under the age of 34 years, the Greens now reportedly poll higher than the Liberals. Their political identities were forged during the climate strike, and they can't understand why Labor and Liberal want more coal and gas. They survived the pandemic only to face no real prospect of owning a home, and now even renting near where they work or study is being put out of reach. The Greens have a vision for the future: free education, free childcare, freeze and cap rents, mental and dental as part of Medicare, a 4-day work week. We are already the only party with a policy to seriously tackle the climate crisis, and we're going to be known as the party with the only serious way of tackling the cost of living and the housing crises too. By stopping the handouts to the big corporations and billionaires and making them pay their fair share of tax, we will fund the services that will make this country more equal, and we will end the housing, the cost of living and the climate crises. And in doing so, we will build a better life for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot to mull over there, a lot of money to potentially consider. But if the tax breaks were cut, as you proposed, as a suggestion for the housing market, would you be willing to pursue this policy, even though the Parliamentary Budget Office has been quoted today as warning that a quick change here could cause more mortgage defaults, potentially an economic shock caused by a sudden drop in house prices? How can you justify taking this position, given that could be the economic outcome for voters at home?
Well, there's a couple of things that we're putting side by side with that weren't taken into account in those comments that were there. Firstly, we're going to ensure that there's a freeze on rents to ensure that there's no adverse effects on that front. Secondly, we're going to have significant government investment in building new public and affordable housing. A big part of the reason that we find ourselves in this situation at the moment, where everyone is thrown to the wolves of the private market with housing, is that governments have not invested and built the public and affordable housing that needs to be built. And they won't under Labor either, because the waiting lists will grow longer. So to respond to that question, A, by capping rents, and B, by having a significant investment of new build of public and affordable housing, and starting that right now, direct government investment starting right now, not a gamble on the stock market, will increase supply. I think that will go a long way to dealing with those potential risks that are said. Having said that, I noticed that the PBO also factored those things in coming up with its costing and coming up with the numbers that it came up with. So it made an assessment about the likelihood of those risks.
Our next question is from Phil Curry.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, Mr Bandt. Phil Curry from the AFR. You talk today, as you do frequently, about the Stage 3 tax cuts as being about $254 billion in tax cuts for billionaires and politicians. So that's a 10-year figure you're using. But the Stage 3 tax cuts will apply to people earning from $42,000 through to $200,000. And the vast majority of that cost will be absorbed in providing the tax cut where most of the workers are, and that's in that $42,000 to $120,000 salary range. Are you saying that those people shouldn't get a tax cut either, or just the people at the top end? And if the latter is your view, Are you aware of how little the savings would actually be compared to the cost of the entire package?
Well, from memory, the top 1% of income earners get 65% of the benefit of these in the first year of operation. Well, this isn't for everyday people. The top 1% get 65% of the benefit of these stage 3 tax cuts. Men get 2/3 of the benefit and women get 1/3. These are tax cuts that will turbocharge inequality. And so it overwhelmingly goes to the top end. Yes, it's over 10 years, but the stage 3 tax cuts sit like a black hole at the centre of this budget, sucking everything else into its gravitational pull, because every decision has to be made around making enough space for $250 billion for tax cuts for Clive Palmer and Gina Rinehart. On the point about the tax rates and the figures that you made, this is an important point. Labor is dismantling Australia's progressive tax system. When I grew up, it was sort of an article of faith in this country that if you earned a lot more, you paid a higher rate of income tax. And it was always those on the left side of politics who defended that. Under Labor's change, a worker on a minimum award wage will end up paying the same rate of tax as a CEO on $200,000 a year. It is a flat tax nightmare. Australia is dismantling Australia's progressive tax system. So that is not the way that you make the country more equal. And lastly, with respect to the low and middle income earners that you refer to, the best way to address the cost of living crisis is through government investment in things like getting dental and mental into Medicare. Right? With the average household unable to afford the dental treatment that it needs because going to the dentist is too expensive, if we've got dental into Medicare, you take a huge amount of pressure off everyday household budgets. That is, you get much better bang for your buck if you're a low and middle income earner by spending the money on getting dental and mental into Medicare and making childcare free than by giving tax cuts that go overwhelmingly to the top.
Thank you.
Karen Barlow.
Hello, Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times. I want to take you beyond the next budget. I think we're all hearing that the next election is on now. The campaign is happening now and you're handing out basically how to vote cards. I want to ask you your level of ambition for the party of renters at the next election. What are you aiming at?
Well, when we go to the rental inspections and hand out our cards for a rent freeze, people get it, right? There was no policy for renters put forward by Labor or Liberal at the last election. The old parties are failing to take renters seriously, but there has been a significant change. We now have seats around the country where the majority of people who live in those seats rent, right? More people rent than own their property in any other means. There is a sea change underway that the others have not caught up with. They're too busy defending the handouts to the property moguls to pay attention to renters. We will be continuing to go to door knock, including in Labor and Liberal held seats, to go to those rental inspections and tell people that it's time that there was a national plan to help renters. And in seats where we saw at the state election, for example, in Victoria, in the state seat of Richmond, where from memory a majority of people rent, we saw the Greens win that seat, including off the back of a campaign around renters' rights. We will make rent a political issue at the next election, and we will tell renters that we are the only party that has a plan for renters' rights. People are responding already. People responded at the Victorian election, and I expect they will at the federal election as well.
Jess Malcolm.
Jess Malcolm from the Australian newspaper. I'd just like to ask how much money you've asked the government for your electrification package expected in the upcoming budget, and if you could put a figure on what you'd be happy with.
I'm not going to put a figure on it. We've had discussions with the government. The government has made a commitment to a substantial and meaningful package, and we expect that to be delivered in the budget, and we'll find out in a couple of weeks' time what is going to be delivered and what the government intends to do. This is critical, though, and it's worth remembering that we asked for this because we were prepared to... historically, we had concerns about the idea of having domestic gas reservations, for example, because it could potentially slow down the transition. But people are in pain now and immediate measures need to be taken. So we worked with the government so the government could put in place a cap on gas prices that is now in place. But to ensure that doesn't slow down the transition, we want households and businesses to have help to get off gas onto electricity. That is what we expect to see in the budget. We expect it to be substantial and meaningful, as the government indicated at the time.
But to Jess's point, are you expecting that what you've put forward is what the government will deliver on? Or are they bringing you inside the tent of agreeing to your position?
We're having discussions with the government about it. I think the government understands the importance of having significant investment so that households and businesses don't have to keep dealing with rising gas prices. We've got to make the change. And I will say that now that there is a cap on gas prices in place, one of the things that does is it puts an end to the need for any new gas exploration or new gas fields, because there is now a cap in place to enable households and businesses to make the transition as we get off gas onto renewables. There's no need for new investment, especially given the cap.
James Massola.
Thanks for that speech, Adam. James Massola from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. I too have an election looking forward question. You spoke a lot in that speech about growing the Greens into a powerful social democratic force. I think sort of quite specifically what I'm curious about is what are your target seats at the next election, and in the event of a balance of power scenario, which is not impossible by any means, it's only a couple of seats, would you seek seats in the federal cabinet were Labor to be seeking your support to form government?
Well, look, as we get closer to the election, we will do what we did at the last election, which is review how things are going, and we'll very likely announce the seats that we intend to campaign on. And perhaps after the last election, I think there might be a bit more of attention on the seats that we announce this time. I'll note that we came very close in the federal seat of Richmond in northern New South Wales. There are other seats in Victoria, like Macnamara, where we also came close. And we're going to continue, and we did well in the state seat of Richmond at the federal election, obviously. We're going to continue to campaign strongly. We've been door-knocking in a number of seats around the country. The seats that we've been door-knocking include those, but also some adjacent Queensland seats, so in seats like Moreton, we've been campaigning in as well, and also seats like Wills and Cooper. We're going to continue to campaign there, especially in those seats where there are a lot of people under severe rental and cost of living stress, putting forward our cost of living alternative as well as our climate alternative. Closer to the time, we'll make an announcement about that. Look, as things stand, the primary goal is not getting shoes under the cabinet table. The primary goal is to get change that will make people's lives better. Like, that's what we're in this for, right? And we have been pushing. We pushed the government to get a limit on the amount of pollution that could come from coal and gas, and we got it. We're going to push the government for action on renters. That's our priority, delivering change that will make people's lives better.
But so Richard Di Natale said to me once he would seek seats in a federal future Labor government if that scenario arose. Are you saying you're not interested, or...?
I'm saying our priority is to get change for people on the cost of living crisis, the rental and housing crisis, and the climate crisis, right? That's our priority at the moment. I think people want to see politicians actually putting forward proposals that will benefit them. I'm not here to talk about what it might mean for us or for the Greens. For me, it's about what it would mean for the people that we're representing.
But if you got the critical mass, would it follow that you would expect to have a seat inside the room?
Look, we will go to the next election with a goal of increasing our representation in the parliament. Of course we will. Every political party will do that. And I think one of the things that I think the penny hasn't yet dropped with the federal government, that we are now in an era where people want political parties to work together. Right? The Labor Party's vote went backwards at the federal election. The Coalition's vote also went backwards. And we now have a situation where less than a third of the country votes for the government, about a third of the country votes for the opposition, and about a third votes for someone else. We are entering a realm where people want third voices at the table, and they want them to work together. And they want them to make a difference for people's lives. And I think that is more important than who sits where around a cabinet table. What matters is Can we get issues like renters, like no new coal and gas, like investment in public housing onto the table and get some action?
Is that the cabinet table? No, I'm just joking. Ben Westcott.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Bandt. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. On the PRRT, have you had any discussions with the Treasurer yet around what their thoughts are, what they're considering, and if the plan happens to be less ambitious than the one you've laid out, would you be considering negotiating on that?
As to the last bit, we've made our position clear to the government and to everyone else about what we think could be done. And I know, and I've heard the Treasurer say publicly that the approach they want to take is just to continue the plan that Josh Frydenberg put in place and potentially make some changes around the edge. That's not enough, right? That is not enough. This government is increasingly becoming a steady as she goes, tick-a-box government that just says, oh, well, if there's a housing crisis, here's our housing policy, tick, job done, right? Since the election, things have got worse. Right? Things are worse than people even thought prior to the election. Whatever the government might have taken before the election isn't necessarily fit for purpose for tackling the crises now. And it's not good enough to just simply say, oh, we might be a little bit less crap than Scott Morrison. Like, that's not what the country needs right now in the crises that we're facing. So yes, we would seek to push and negotiate to, if the government doesn't come up with a gas tax fix that actually makes the gas corporations pay their fair share of tax, yes, we will push and negotiate and improve that, because this will be our opportunity to make these big gas corporations pay their fair share of tax. Like, in 1 year, 27 big gas corporations brought in $73 billion of revenue and paid no tax, right? When a nurse pays more tax than a multinational, something is wrong in Australia. This is our chance to fix it, and we'll be pushing the government to make these big gas corporations pay their fair share of tax.
Just checking, have you spoken to the Treasurer about it yet?
Well, we've said to the government, here's our proposal, here's what we want. They know very, very clearly. We've released a PBO costing that shows how much could be raised by making them pay royalties. I mean, on our proposal, it's worth knowing that in many instances, a lot of these gas corporations get their gas for free. They don't even pay royalties for it, right? That's how broken the tax is in this country. We've got a costing by the PBO that says make them pay royalties, then make them pay their fair share of tax as they were meant to, get rid of the credits that they've been able to build up because the tax was so poorly designed in the first place. And there's $9 billion a year to help do things like get dental into Medicare or fund a rent freeze. And I think the government knows very clearly that that's what we want. We'll find out in a couple of weeks what they're prepared to do.
Thank you.
Some of those companies do dispute that characterisation, but we could spend time on that. Instead, we'll hear from Paul Karp.
Thanks. The Greens housing spokesperson has 4 petitions on his website opposing or arguing to scale down developments at Birdwood Avenue, Davies Park, Bulimba Barracks and Tugalawa Park. Can the Greens be a bigger part of the solution by less NIMBYing of developments that increase housing supply? And how many extra dwellings would you volunteer to be built in Melbourne, Brisbane, Ryan and Griffith? Look,
let's be crystal clear. Where the growth has been in housing in many areas has been in inner city areas like mine, right? It's been areas where the Greens vote has been high that have seen the highest increases in density in housing. The last time I asked the Parliamentary Library to go and have a look at it, it was in Liberal, now some independent electorates where the council, where for whatever reason the developments had not gone ahead. That's where the growth hasn't been. Where it has been in talking about areas that I know about, has been in like areas of Melbourne and also south of the river in Macnamara, right? So there has been significant increase in density and significant housing growth in areas where the Greens have got a strong vote. Now, in terms of, and I know that you mentioned that particular seat, I know that there are some projects there, for example, where there's been proposals to build on an area that's a floodplain that's been inundated by floods, and that even the Labor Party is also opposing those particular developments. So, of course, from time to time, there's going to be arguments about whether it should be this particular place or that particular place. I have been a really strong advocate for increased public housing in my electorate of Melbourne, and you find other Greens MPs right across the country saying exactly the same. And what we've been confronted with is Labor parties at the state level that are selling off public land and selling it off to private developers. So yes, from time to time there might be discussion about whether or not it should be built at this particular place or that particular place, but what you find, and this is what this dispute with the government at the moment is about, the Greens want more public housing and more affordable housing in areas close to where people work, and Labor is not up for it.
Noor Hayder.
Thanks for your speech, Noor Hayder, ABC News. The government's under pressure to right a wrong of the past and restore the single parenting payment to more mothers. There are suggestions that the government may expand it to sole parents with children under the age of 12 as opposed to 16. What is your view on that, and would you support it?
Labor shouldn't expect applause for reversing a decision it should never have made in the first place. Labor's decision to try and balance the budget by attacking single parents ripped $100 a week out of many single parents and plunged them and their children into poverty. Right, single parents do it tough. There are plenty of other places to balance the budget rather than coming after single parents, but that's what Labor did. They need to fully reverse that decision as a bare minimum. Like, there is no excuse for keeping single parents and their children in poverty just because Labor made a bad decision in the past. We opposed it at the time. We said very clearly, you don't need to do this. There are other ways of raising money. Labor went ahead and did it at a bare minimum. I mean, Labor should have gone to the election promising to undo that terrible decision that they made almost a decade ago. They should reverse it, and then we should lift all income support payments above the poverty line. There's money there to do that. Much better to have single parents living a dignified life out of poverty than giving Gina Reinhart and Clive Palmer a $9,000 a year tax cut.
And the age bracket, including
Well, look, again, like, just reverse the decision fully, lift everyone's income support payment above the poverty line, and that way you ensure that everyone has a dignified life. We'll see whatever Labor comes up with, but I'm just furious that the government says that there's $250 billion for stage 3 tax cuts and $368 billion for nuclear submarines, but they can't commit to lifting single parents and job seekers and people with a disability out of poverty. Right? This is why Labor is becoming a centre-right party that prioritises tax cuts for the wealthy over building more public housing. And the Prime Minister has spent the last 3 days dressing himself in khaki and talking about tax cuts for the wealthy while people live in poverty. In my electorate, there are people living in tents because they can't afford a place to live. I am trying to find houses for pregnant women who are couch surfing, right? We have people who are spending 60% of their income on rent, and queues at food banks are growing. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister goes and talks about missiles. I want to hear less talk from the Prime Minister about missiles and more about funding a rent freeze and lifting people out of poverty. Because in a wealthy country like ours, where Labor can afford $250 billion to give Clive Palmer and Gina Reinhart a tax cut, it makes me incredibly angry that they're leaving people in poverty and then tinkering around the edges and saying maybe we'll raise income support by a little bit. No, I want to hear less talk about missiles and more talk about fixing the rental and housing crisis by putting a rent freeze on and building an adequate number of public housing so that everyone in this wealthy country of ours has a place to live.
Thanks.
Ashley Wick.
Ashley Wick from 9 News here. Thank you for your speech. I'd like to ask you about the rent freeze proposal. To what extent do the states need to be on board or involved with this? And have any discussions been had on a federal or state level about the plan you've put forward?
Look, we've certainly been putting it forward at the state level and here in the ACT. Where the Greens are with Labor in power, they have moved towards having some forms of rent control. So we know that it's able to be done, and we've put it to state colleagues as well, and it was the state governments who, working together with the federal government, actually froze rents in some places during the pandemic. So we know that they can do it. The federal government needs to take responsibility for getting the states on board. Like, when it came to rising power bills, the Prime Minister had discussions with state counterparts, Labor and Liberal, organised the recall of Parliament and got urgent legislation passed through the Parliament. We want the Prime Minister to treat the rental crisis with the same degree of urgency that he did with rising power bills. Yes, it will take working together with the states, but that's what National Cabinet is for. And if the Prime Minister can do it with power bills, then he can do it with rent as well. Now, as an incentive to get the states on board, the federal government has a lot of power. And that's why we're saying offer the states some extra money on the condition that they freeze rents so that the states can then go and build or buy some extra properties to deal with the rental crisis right now, and everyone will win out of it. So there's a pathway to make it happen, but that's what National Cabinet's for. And if Labor, it's wall-to-wall Labor governments on the mainland at the moment. They can't wash their hands of the rental crisis anymore. That's what National Cabinet is for. And if Labor doesn't act, it's only because they don't want to act.
Thank you.
Julie Hare.
Thank you. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. The Greens policy is for free education from early childhood right through to university. Aside from the fact that nearly 1 in 2 Australian families have rejected their right to a free high school education and choose to pay fees, my back-of-the-envelope maths suggests that your ideas for free university and universal free childcare would cost in excess of $20 billion a year, plus the additional $80 billion for writing off HECS debt. The reason we have HECS in the first place is so the working poor don't subsidise the middle classes to get a university education to make them even richer. So I'm just wondering if you could help explain how the Greens reconcile this dilemma between rich and poor, education and non-education.
Look, my dad was the first person in his family to go to university. Like, he came from a very working class household and he was able to go because education was free, right? And the increasing debt that people are under now is an added burden in a cost of living crisis, and it is forcing people to reconsider what they do. Like, why is it that the federal government wants to raise more money from student debt than it does from the gas corporations in the budget? Education is a good for not only the people who do it, but for the whole society, We can make education free in this country again. A lot of politicians at the moment, including those in Cabinet, enjoyed a free education, and they're pulling up the ladder behind them and putting everyone else into huge debt. And now we have a situation where, as of today, there's about 500,000 people across the country who've got a HECS debt of over $40,000. They're going to have to pay about an extra $3,000 today as a result of the CPI figures and the indexation that the government is ignoring. So the government is saying, Labor is saying, we will put students and former students who've done the right thing into further debt in order to help balance the budget and ignore the big gas corporations and instead fund a $9,000 a year tax cut to Clive Palmer. So I suspect we may have a philosophical difference about the role of education in society. The Greens believe that everyone should have the right to a free education, no matter what their income or what background they come from. And the way you pay for it is through a progressive tax system where you don't give Clive Palmer and Gina Rinehart a tax cut that they don't need, right? You instead make them pay their fair share of tax, you make the big corporations pay their fair share of tax, and then everyone, from working class or otherwise, is able to go to TAFE, to university, to get the education they need and to be able to do it on a lifelong basis as well. That's what a good society looks like.
Dominic Giannini.
Dominic Giannini from Australian Associated Press. I just want to ask about national security. You've been critical about the money being spent on submarines as well as money going to gas and fossil fuel companies. How would you invest in national security in our region if not for the submarines, and as well as energy security for Australia, given that there's some concerns that Chinese investment might come and fill the gap in the market and that could lead to an overrepresentation in our resource sector?
Look, one of our biggest concerns about the direction the government is taking us is that it makes Australia less safe. Right? One of the biggest threats to Australia is the risk of conflict between the US and China. That would be disastrous for the world, but for Australia as well. Australia's role as a country that has a relationship with both of those countries must be to try and de-escalate tensions. And instead the government's going in a different direction, which is joining one side of the conflict unequivocally and making the Australian Defence Force an offshoot of the US Defence Force, and signing Australia up to go to war again with the US whenever the US decides on its next military adventurism. Right, that does not make Australia more safe, it makes Australia less safe. So our concern is that what Australia should be doing, and on this, here's where I agree with Paul Keating. I think that Foreign Minister Penny Wong's rhetoric on this is right, and it's a welcome change from the last government, but the actions are something completely different. The actions are writing an open chequebook to the US for Australia to start buying military equipment that is about being an offshoot of the US in the next offensive action that it decides to engage in our region. So we want to see Australia made safer. That doesn't come by spending $368 billion on nuclear submarines. It comes from using Australia's existing relationships and existing power to de-escalate tensions. Like, that is what would ultimately make Australia safer. On the energy security question, we are blessed as a country with so much sun and wind, and we are blessed with the opportunity to start exporting that sun and wind. And this is a huge, huge opportunity for Australia to start sending our sunshine overseas in the form of liquid hydrogen or via undersea cables coming out from the north of this country. And increasingly, that is what our trading partners are asking for. They'll be asking for clean, zero emissions fuels. And we're also really lucky that a lot of the places along the eastern seaboard in particular, but also over on the west, where the ability to generate that form of sending solar fuels overseas come from, are also the areas where we need to make the transition out of coal and gas. And so to ensure Australia's energy security, but also to tackle the climate crisis, we need to invest massively in transitioning to those kind of new exports to ensure that there are jobs there for those people in those regions, but also that we have something to sell the rest of the world when the rest of the world tells us to stop digging.
What happens if China doesn't de-escalate?
Sorry?
What happens if China doesn't de-escalate?
Well, that's got to be our priority, because if we don't put everything into a strategy of de-escalation between US and China, then the risks are far too high. We are talking about potential nuclear conflict, right? And that is something that should be the number one priority to try and avoid.
Nick Stewart.
I didn't hear much sympathy in your speech for those struggling Australian landlords like the Prime Minister who are just getting by on $250,000 a year. On the other point, though, that's the way we build the housing stock in Australia, is by encouraging people to invest in rental housing, which they can make money out of by gouging tenants. Isn't it the case that if you introduce these rent freezes, it will stop that investment into housing? Or is it, on the other hand, not a concern for you because you know that you'll be, even though you can't block the budget because it's all one bill, you will reap the dividend yourself come the next election as a result of people being angry at what's happening?
Well, to answer that first question, the answer is no, and there's two reasons for that. One is that only 3% of the properties that the investors buy are new properties. Right? What this is at the moment, negative gearing and capital gains for these investors, just allows these investors who've already got two houses to go to the auction and stand next to a first home buyer and keep bidding and bidding and bidding and pushing the price up, knowing that the public is going to write them a cheque at the end of it to cover their losses, right, or to help cover their losses. It is public investment to push up house prices and push it out of the reach of first homeowners. But it's existing properties that they're primarily buying. These people who are taking advantage of negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, they are not buying and investing in new properties. It is just existing ones, and it is pushing up the price of existing ones. The second reason that the answer is no is that this is why we need governments to get back what governments used to do in the past and just start building public housing themselves. Right? Not put $10 billion on the stock market and say if we get enough money, we might spend anywhere between $0 and $500 million on any given year helping someone else buy something. Government should just build their damn houses themselves like we used to. And it's the fact that government has stopped building public housing that has led, in part, to this high pressure in the private rental market at the bottom end, because there just isn't the public housing there to keep up with it. And nothing that the government is doing is going to fix that. In fact, under their proposal, the public and social and affordable housing waiting list grows. So there's two reasons why the answer to your question is no.
So Albanese is out of touch?
I think this government Labor is increasingly out of touch with what life is like for renters. I think the Prime Minister does not understand just how tough renters are doing it at the moment. Where the Prime Minister stands up in question time and calls action to help renters pixie dust, and he heaps scorn on all of the renters who are doing it tough at the moment. The government does not understand that queues at food banks are growing. People are spending 60% of their income in rent. People are being forced to live out of their cars. And to dismiss all solutions to fix that and call it pixie dust is not only the height of arrogance, it's a government that doesn't understand the scale of the crisis and what is needed to fix it. People are doing it tough right now. Renters need help right now, and the government needs to help them right now, not chuck scorn on them in question time.
And our final question comes from Victoria Kelly-Clark.
Hi, Victoria Kelly-Clark, The Epoch Times. You noted before that Australia needs to publicly invest massively in a climate change transition for renewable energy. How do you foresee that happening in Australia? How would you like to see the government invest into New South Wales energy market to actually help change that situation?
We need a significant investment, publicly led, to shift Australia to 100% renewables and create new export industries. One of the ways that could be done is through the government already owns a publicly owned electricity generator. It's called Snowy Hydro, and there's a retailer attached to it. We want to see that massively beefed up and a new build through Snowy Hydro, through a revamped Snowy Hydro, a new build of publicly owned renewable energy to replace the approximately, I think it's 25 gigawatt roughly, that is roughly the size of Australia's coal fleet at the moment. Let's build that again in renewables. Let's extend our transmission lines, again through significant public investment. Last time I looked at it, you know, we know, and we saw when South Australia got hit a couple of years back, we know that our interconnectors in this country need massive investment. Part of the interconnectors, certainly it was a couple of years ago, part of the interconnectors in this country, critical infrastructure, are part owned by a Cayman Islands registered company, right? This should be in public hands. It is essential service and it should be in public hands. So big, significant public investment to build new generation, to build new transmission, and critically to build new export industries. This is one of the reasons that we're prepared to work with the government on the National Reconstruction Fund. We took a similar policy to the election to ensure an expansion of manufacturing in this country, particularly manufacturing that would support us in a zero pollution world. We're able to secure some changes to ensure that that doesn't get used by the next government as a fossil fuel slush fund. It's that investment in manufacturing, the big investment in transmission, big investment in new generation that will see us not only create thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs, but is going to ensure that we have the best chance of tackling the climate crisis and that we have something to sell the rest of the world that's not coal and gas.
So would you like to see, say, the AUKUS nuclear sub-deal completely wiped and that money then put into the public fund so that you can address that climate crisis?
Look, I'd like to see us stop giving handouts to coal and gas corporations and use that money instead to start building the clean energy infrastructure of the future and create new clean energy export industries.
And we'll just probably leave it there as we're wrapping up the broadcast. I think we're going back to an earlier point, but fundamentally, thank you so much for joining us today, Adam Bandt. You've got a membership to the club.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.